Andersonville Cemetery, Georgia, 100 or so miles south of Atlanta. Here, each Memorial Day, the prisoners of war from every conflict in which the United States has participated are jointly remembered. It is an occasion, too, for veterans to get together and reminisce, and for former captives to recall their repatriation and be thankful. The Civil War was one where prisoners did suffer unduly, where it was as dangerous to be captured as to remain in combat. Yet it was brother causing suffering to brother, for both were Americans. Just as they marched into battle, shoulder to shoulder, so were they buried. 56,000 died in the prisons of North and South, and many today still ask why. The northern prisoners who died here at Andersonville were the victims of overcrowding, malnutrition, and shortage of medicine, resulting, ironically, from the Union's blockade of the South and their ending of prisoner exchanges. Andersonville was a blot on the face of Southern honor. Many cite it as what happens when notions of total war get out of hand. As the casualties escalated and both sides grew frustrated, the South realized that after Gettysburg, a military victory was a forlorn dream and foreign intervention now unlikely. The Union leadership, for its part, was determined to make the struggle so unpleasant for Southerners, civilians and soldiers alike, that their will to resist would weaken first.
If you look at the second inaugural address of Lincoln, where he says, if every drop of blood drawn by the slash must be repaid by one drawn by the sword, so as it was said 2,000 years ago in the Bible, so be it. God is on our side, and that's the conviction of both sides. And if you, for example, listen to the music, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the terrible swiftness of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. That kind of attitude means, therefore, that you are fighting not simply a war, you're fighting a holy crusade. In the South, as the war began to escalate and the consequences of the war began to become clearly evident, everyone in the South understood that the whole of what was the South was now on the wheel of fortune, and no one could be sure what the consequences were going to be.
Southern mothers were now left to grieve, not just at a son departing, but more likely at a son killed. Both sides were dipping deep into their manpower reserves. Violent protests, as happened here in New York City, followed the resort to a draft in the North, a year after the Confederacy had done so. Estimates of the numbers killed in the New York draft riots of July 1863 vary from 120 to 1,200, though at the time some of the wilder rumors put the figure at several thousand. Certainly, they were the worst street violence America has ever known. Units that had recently fought at Gettysburg had to be recalled to quell them. What began as a protest against the first draft under the new law quickly turned into an ugly race riot, in which not only was a Negro orphanage burnt to the ground, but at least a dozen blacks were senselessly lynched. Resentment towards Negroes among immigrant communities, such as the Irish, had been inflamed by recent strikes broken by employers bringing in blacks. The riots showed that racial prejudice was never far below the surface in the North. Lincoln was determined, though, to press on with emancipation.
Essentially what emancipation is a very carefully measured political device on Lincoln's part to weaken the South and strengthen the North. By that I mean that he proclaimed that all of the slaves in areas behind Confederate lines were free as of the 1st of January 1863. It's a clever proclamation in the sense that Lincoln proclaimed freedom in areas that he had no control over. And he specifically exempted those areas, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Louisiana, that had already been recaptured. He specifically exempted them from the proclamation, specifically exempted the border slave states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, and essentially said that those blacks behind Confederate lines, if they could manage to get free, that is, to escape through the lines, would be free. It prompted a rather massive exodus of blacks towards the northern side. The South, in turn, had to take a variety of kinds of precautions. And the result of this sort of balancing act is that the North gets measurably stronger, the South becomes measurably weaker. And I would say that after January 63, one sees a decisive weakening in the Southern effort and a progressive strengthening in the Northern effort.
Recruitment of Negro troops began in the North after January 1863. Eventually, 200,000 would serve the Union, about a tenth of the total strength. At first, they were given menial duties. Lincoln, like others, was not convinced of their military value. Black leaders, however, believed that once former slaves had fought for their country, they would not be denied citizenship. Wherever it appeared in the South, the Federal Army acted as a magnet in drawing out the slaves. Most blacks could recall the moment when a Northern official first told them they were free. By the end of the war, about a quarter of the slave population in the Confederacy had freed itself by moving behind Union lines. This loss hindered the Southern war effort. Hitherto, they had cooked, cleaned, dug trenches, done everything short of firing a gun. Now the North was to benefit from their services, though for many their reception was not as warm nor their treatment as tactful as it might have been. Some came to the sad conclusion that there was not much difference between freedom and slavery. Crammed into improvised camps, they were vulnerable to disease as well as to white predators. Many had such unhappy experiences at the hands of their Northern liberators that it affected their attitudes forever. What they cried out for was land from which to derive a livelihood. But even Lincoln was not ready for this. For the South, though, the freeing of the slaves had set in train a great social revolution. It was ironic that the Southern way of life, epitomized by these great plantation houses of Virginia, which the Confederates had gone to war to protect, was now being changed inexorably by that war. Whether or not the South now won, their way of life was changed forever. The slaves had gone that made the running of these great plantations possible. To wage the war, the Confederate leadership had introduced industry to the South, had created a mercantile class, had encouraged the growing of grain. The plantation aristocracy that had taken the South into secession was by the third year of the war thoroughly discredited.
Jefferson Davis, in my opinion, was not the right man to lead the Confederacy. He was certainly patriotic enough. He believed in the Confederacy. He believed completely in the will to win, but he didn't make the right kinds of plans. Moreover, Davis didn't use his patronage wisely. Davis didn't cultivate people. He was too rigid, too inflexible, too unwilling to be a diplomat. And also, I think Davis had already decided the men that should command, and once Davis committed himself to someone, it was very hard for him to change his mind. He supported incompetent people throughout the war, even when their incompetence is obvious to nearly everyone else. So Davis didn't have a plan to win. Davis didn't always pick the right generals. And Davis offended many of the people that he needed for his support. So in that sense, I think the Confederacy was not well served.
During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln acted much more decisively in mobilizing the North. He was willing to violate civil liberties in a way even more than Jefferson Davis was in the South. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He was willing to imprison dissenters. But you can't compare the freedom of North and South simply on the basis of how many people were put in prison. The North was basically a more free society than the South before the war, and it remained so during the war.
Lincoln in 1864 faced re-election. With war weariness mounting in the North, many did not expect him to succeed. For the South, a Lincoln defeat at the polls was possibly its last chance of winning independence. To avoid this, Lincoln needed a startling military victory. After Gettysburg, stalemate had ensued in the East. Hopefully for him, success might come elsewhere. Morale among the Southern troops remained surprisingly high despite all the setbacks. It had been helped by a religious revival within many of the camps in which Robert E. Lee himself had participated. Although declining in numbers, the rebel army was now mainly composed of battle-hardened veterans, prepared to see the struggle through. Pride still prevailed with them. Most Confederate soldiers came from rural areas where families were clannish. Many preferred to die rather than be called coward or let down their companions. Least of all, disgrace their neighborhood. Peer pressure was strong. After Gettysburg, the Southern armies had retreated to Virginia, where they had been largely left alone to lick their wounds and regroup. Indeed, the Eastern Front was relatively quiet for the rest of the year. The main center of activity was elsewhere, in the West. In Tennessee, where Lincoln had his eyes on Chattanooga, which stood on a vital east-west rail link where the Tennessee River cut through the mountains. Capturing Chattanooga would further split the Confederacy and provide a springboard for a drive on Atlanta, one of the South's key communication and manufacturing centers. Chattanooga, with its important railroads, fell in September 1863. Now the Northern troops could follow the line towards Atlanta, which they lost no time in doing. The Confederates had seemingly withdrawn in confusion, but they were merely baiting a trap into which the overconfident Yankees almost fell. The ambush was discovered 12 miles south of Chattanooga at Chickamauga Creek, which in Cherokee means River of Blood. Alas, it was to live up to its name. The ensuing battle produced some of the war's most savage and chaotic fighting, much of it in thick woods. Because an order was misinterpreted, the Union line was breached. Retreating to Chattanooga, the North's commander was replaced by Ulysses S. Grant, who counterattacked where he thought the South's defenses were weakest, on so-called Lookout Mountain.
The Battle of Lookout Mountain was fought basically for control of the vital federal supply routes running along the Tennessee River into the city of Chattanooga for the help of the besieged Union Army there. As you can see behind me, the bend in the Tennessee River is easily commanded by this position here on top of Lookout Mountain. And so on November the 24th of 1863, federal forces under the command of General Hooker were ordered to seize Lookout Mountain from Confederate forces in order so that the Yankee supply line could be easily maintained without being harassed by Confederate artillery up here on the top of the mountain. On the 24th, it was a very misty day, a very cloudy day, and it was a very low cloud line hanging around the mountain, so the battle became known as the Battle Above the Clouds because of the men fighting in the mist. Federal forces assaulted the hill, drove the Confederates off of half of it, and then, like on a giant door hinge, they swung around the front of the mountain and began driving the Confederates down the back side. They probably would have succeeded in doing this, but darkness stopped them, and both sides got ready to continue the fight the next day. During the course of the night, though, the Southerners realized that they could not possibly hold back the superior federal forces that were attacking them, so under the cover of darkness, they withdrew from this position to their further eastern position on Missionary Ridge.
Despite their success on Lookout Mountain, the Northerners were slow to move against Missionary Ridge. To hasten them, Grant ordered a frontal assault, meant merely as a diversion. But defying the lessons of such previous assaults at Gettysburg and elsewhere, the Union troops surged up the steep face. The Southerners could not depress their cannons sufficiently to shoot at them, so they carried on in one of the most dramatic moments of the war, sweeping the rebels from what had been thought an impregnable position. Chickamauga was avenged. The Confederates were pursued into the mountains towards Atlanta, but winter set in before they could be dislodged. Meanwhile, bridges across the Tennessee River were speedily repaired as Chattanooga was turned into a great staging post for the coming campaign against Atlanta. Freight trains by the hundred would trundle into town laden with men and equipment. The North meant business. At long last, its industrial might was beginning to tell. The South was being outproduced as well as outmanned. Huge numbers of fresh horses had to be found and forage gathered to feed them. Such were the North's resources that demands on this scale could now be taken in its stride. With the blockade beginning to bite, for the South and its suffering people, it was a different story.
The blockade was definitely a factor in the defeat of the Confederacy. However, I don't believe the blockade was a major factor. I think the Confederacy could have withstood the blockade. It could have developed facilities in order to withstand defeat. That was not a major factor in the defeat. Blockade runners were able to get in and out throughout the war, including blockade runners in and out Charleston Harbor.
Charleston, long the focus of Northern fury as the birthplace of secession and hence the cradle of rebellion, as well as a major blockade-running port, became the target during 1863 and 1864 for much federal naval attention. A young Virginian painter-turned-soldier, Conrad Wise Chapman, was commissioned by the local Confederate commander to record Charleston's dogged resistance. Charleston first had to endure bombardment from the sea, followed by assault from the shore, when the Union secured, at great human cost, a foothold on one of the islands skirting the harbor. Eventually, Fort Sumter itself was reduced to rubble, this time by Federal guns. But still the rebels refused to yield, though it meant that Charleston's days as a blockade-running port were effectively over by the summer of 1864. Charleston's great attraction to the blockade runners was its nearness to Bermuda and the Bahamas, both British colonies then and centers of the lucrative blockade-running business. It was this activity that made them, since until then they had been backwaters. With Charleston's closure, blockade running became centered on Mobile Bay on the Gulf and Wilmington in North Carolina. As well as weapons, the runners, many of them British-built and captained, brought in luxuries that commanded premium prices in the South. But for the Union Navy, a bigger worry than the blockade runners were the ships that preyed on merchant vessels, like this, the Alabama, built in Britain, as many of them were. It was the crew of the Federal sloop Kearsarge that finally gave the Alabama its comeuppance, though not before several hundred northern merchant vessels had been sunk. The incident produced bitter diplomatic wrangles between London and Washington, particularly as the raiders often carried a complement of British mariners. The Alabama's demise was in the English Channel off Cherbourg one Sunday morning in June 1864. Trainloads of sightseers had come down from Paris for the occasion, but the South went on securing its supplies as best it could.
Virtually everything useful to the South was traded. In fact, some New York merchants said they could deliver locomotives, if necessary, through the blockade by way of the British West Indies. But ammunition, guns, swords, uniforms, shoes. The most important single article was food, particularly salt pork, which was a staple item in the Confederate Army and which was in very short supply in the South from early in the war because of a great hog cholera epidemic that had begun before the war and continued during the war. So salt pork was of enormous importance in keeping Confederate armies in the field. In early 1863, it's quite possible that without the pork coming through the lines, Lee's army would have had to been disbanded, at least in large part. About 4 million pounds of bacon came through the lines in southeastern Virginia and North Carolina in the early months of '63, and this was the margin of difference for Lee's army.
However much Lee might have despised such trading with the enemy, he also had to put up with those state governors who wanted to keep back supplies for their own special needs.
When Lee's soldiers would go barefoot, George had enough shoes in its warehouses to give 2 pair to every soldier in the army. When Lee's soldiers froze in the winter, there were enough blankets in the warehouses of Georgia to equip the whole of Lee's army. They wouldn't let it go out of the state.
Contrary to impressions, it was the North that was having problems filling its ranks that summer of 1864. War weariness was at its height, and Lincoln despaired of being re-elected. His defeat might well be the South's last chance to win independence. Although Northerners would not admit it, there was still a lot of life left in the Confederacy. Morale, miraculously, was being maintained among its frontline troops. The rebels could still produce the unexpected, as demonstrated in the Shenandoah Valley close to Washington one day in May. The valley was supposed to have been cleared of Confederates. But even the best laid schemes are not always followed. The Union plan had been to use the valley to get behind Lee's supply lines and threaten Richmond. Instead, the Federals were confronted with a bunch of determined Southerners at the little town of New Market. Among their number were a couple of hundred teenage cadets from a local military school. The cadets were to conduct themselves bravely in a battle warmly remembered by many Southerners. Although they seemed hopelessly outnumbered, the rebels fended off the Northern attacks. After all, it was their land that the Yankees were invading. Spearheaded by the cadets who fearlessly stormed the Federal guns on the hill overlooking the town, the Confederates routed the Northerners from the valley and went on to threaten Washington itself. Even at this late stage, the Union generals were still learning. Grant's appointment in March 1864 as commander-in-chief of all the Union forces in both East and West was one hopeful sign for the North, and one less so for the South. He was determined to strike against Lee as soon as possible, and chose to do so halfway between Washington and Richmond in the area known as the Wilderness. It was not an auspicious start.
Standing behind these Confederate trenches at the Wilderness battlefield, it's clear why the soldiers referred to this engagement in the spring of 1864 as bushwhacking on a grand scale. This was the first battle in which Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee ever met. And it was a 2-day vicious engagement characterized by fighting among troops who really couldn't see one another. Grand movements were not typical of the Battle of the Wilderness. Confusion in these thick woods was more typical of the fighting here. The battle lasted 2 days, May 5th and 6th, and it cost some 26,000 casualties on both sides. Grant, by all estimates, had the worst of it here at the Wilderness, But unlike his predecessors, Ambrose Burnside and Joseph Hooker, who had also crossed the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers in 62 and 63, Grant took a licking from Robert E. Lee, but decided not to retreat. He made a decision to continue moving south and, as he said, fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. This was the first engagement of a long series of battles that would continue until the end of the war.
Within the week, the two armies were battling it out again a few miles nearer Richmond at Spotsylvania Courthouse, a crossroads village controlling the shortest route to the Confederate capital. Here was some of the most vicious fighting of the war at a point on the rebel line which became known ever after as Bloody Angle. The burial parties had a grim task. 14,000 lost their lives. Another 16,000 were severely wounded. The North's losses could be replaced. Not so those of the South. Some of the most poignant photographs to come out of the Civil War are those of the Confederate dead that fourth summer of the war. The South, alas, was losing the flower of its manhood. Knowing this, Grant was determined to maintain the pressure without pity. But Lee met his every ploy. It was a question of whose strength or whose patience would sap first.
The men were still fighting by old-time tactics, in a sense. Robert E. Lee, Sir Winston Churchill often called the last of the great old-fashioned generals. But this war also produced a new breed of general, the Grants and Shermans and Thomases of the North, men who believed that war was no longer merely a chess game, but rather war was a conflict that had to be taken to an entire country, its civilian population included. We call that today total war. We accept that today as war. It was a great transition for the people back then, which is simply why Sherman's march through Georgia and to the sea seems so brutal and atrocious.
William Tecumseh Sherman is the Civil War general most associated with the term total war. He had succeeded Grant in the West. Sherman now sought to exert his particular brand of pressure on the Confederates. He began his drive towards Atlanta as Grant was moving against Lee. The terrain was very different, and the tactics too. Sherman preferred to outflank his opponent rather than attack him head-on. The occasion when he did not, here at Kennesaw Mountain in June, he suffered more casualties in a few hours than in the whole of his campaign hitherto. Because his goal, Atlanta, was in sight, Sherman's patience seemed to escape him. The lesson was not lost, and he promptly returned to his previous tactics, which again worked. By early July, Sherman was within 5 miles of Atlanta. As he began his bombardment, panic seized its citizens, and those who could fled, jamming the roads and crowding the trains going south. When the citizens complained, he merely increased the shelling. War, he told them, was hell, and the sooner they surrendered, the better. The fighting was bitter, but the heart had been knocked out of the defenders. Atlanta faced the inevitable. As Sherman's men entered the ravaged city, Lincoln had the victory he needed to ensure his re-election.
Bring the good old bugle boys, we'll sing another song. Sing it with a spirit that will start the world along. Sing it as we used to sing it, 50,000 strong, while we were marching through Georgia. Hurrah, hurrah, we bring the Jubilee. Hurrah.
Sherman turned Atlanta over to his forces and ordered its citizens to leave. When they protested, he simply replied, "You cannot refine war." To his colleagues, he argued, "We may not change the hearts of these people, but we can make them so sick of war that generations would pass before they would again resort to it." This is as near a definition of total war as one is likely to get.
Sherman's dashing Yankee boys will never reach the coast. So the saucy rebels said, and 'twas a handsome boast. Had they not forgot, alas, to reckon with the host, while we were marching through Georgia.
Sherman now began his wrecking march to the sea. Before leaving Atlanta, he ripped up every railroad track there was. He was cutting himself loose from his supply base and would live off the land, destroying what he did not need, determined, as he put it, to make Georgia howl. Lincoln's Navy gave him that summer a much more dramatic success in many ways than Atlanta, when in a daring raid they closed the last of the blockade-running ports on the Gulf Coast, Alabama's Mobile Bay. It was a further tightening of the squeeze on the Confederacy. David Farragut was the hero of the hour. His order to his fleet, when it became stuck in a minefield of "damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead," has entered into naval history. Farragut negotiated the mines and went on to eliminate the opposing fleet, including their new giant ironclad, the Tennessee, on which the rebels had placed such great hopes. All in all, it had been quite a summer for the North, and Lincoln in particular. Many Southerners now felt they had shot their last bolt.
I think the South had 3 chances to win the war. I think in the very first few months, they could have pulled off a military victory. In the summer of '61, I think they were that strong in comparison to what the North was at that time. I think by the end of '61, that was gone. I think their second hope for success was foreign recognition, if that was at all reality. And I think Antietam ended that. And their third hope was a political settlement, was Lincoln's defeat. And the fall of Atlanta ended that.
Northerners wondered why Southerners fought on after Atlanta and put it down to a death wish. Certainly the way they kept coming at the Yankee guns suggested that. Many a Union officer commented after a battle on the fearful disregard for life by the rebels opposing him. The Confederacy was losing the flower of its manhood as if it had no tomorrow. Abraham Lincoln's second inauguration in March 1865. When he spoke about malice toward none and charity for all, he seemed to be extending an olive branch to the South. But who was capable of grasping it now? The Confederate heartland had already been ravaged by Sherman. Leaving Atlanta, he had taken but a few destructive weeks to reach the coast at Savannah. Then, after pausing, he set off through the Carolinas towards the rear of Lee's forces outside Richmond, again laying waste everything in his path. Sherman aimed to cripple the will of Southerners, civilians and soldiers alike. Charleston, the cradle of the rebellion, lay in ruins. Few in the North shed a tear, regarding it as just deserts for the firing on Fort Sumter. South Carolina's state capital, Columbia, came in for harsh treatment. Half of it was leveled. generations of Southerners would never forgive Sherman.
It was the first time that a modern army had cut loose from everybody, from its communications and supply, and actually existed by living off the country. And he foraged quite liberally, a path 80 miles long and about 1,000 miles wide. He burned most of it, but he swept it clean of food and supplies. Otherwise, whether he could use them or not, he left them to rot if he couldn't use them. He was, of course, not the first total war man. There have been total warriors ever since warfare began, but he was the first in modern times who embraced the idea that if you could kill the civilians' will to resist, you would inevitably kill the Army's will to resist. And in fact, that happened.
Sherman planned to link up with Grant outside Petersburg and tighten the noose on the Confederate capital, Richmond. While he and his men had been marching great distances and winning great victories, the Federals there had been bogged down in a bloody siege since the previous summer. For the siege, the Union brought up giant mortars like this, nicknamed the Dictator. Earthworks were soon a feature of the Petersburg scene. Grant and his men edged them westward, intent on stretching Lee's forces and cutting off his supply lines to Richmond and to the rest of the Confederacy. Petersburg's luckless civilians and garrison were subject to daily bombardment from the hundreds of cannon now ringing them. While they suffered, Grant fumed with frustration. Siege warfare was not to his liking. So when a group of former Pennsylvania miners came to him in late June 1864 with the idea of breaching the Confederate lines by digging a mine shaft under them and filling it with gunpowder, he backed it warmly. The shaft ran 500 feet, and its construction was a remarkable effort. But the opportunity to benefit from the vast explosion was bungled, with heavy loss of Union as well as Confederate lives.
Here around us, we see the resulting Battle of the Crater. The mine blew up the Confederate battery and the greater part of 2 South Carolina regiments and created a great cavity in the earth, a breach in the defenses of Petersburg. Into this breach, the 9th Corps was expected to pour to sever the Confederate lines and capture Petersburg. But things did not work out as the Yankees had planned.
It was back to more conventional siege methods after the Crater fiasco. For the rest of the year, the remorseless bombardment continued day after day around Petersburg. But Northerners could now rely on their greater industrial might, and nowhere was this more evident than in the building of a railway from their supply base on the James River right up to their lines at Petersburg itself. Also in their development of still heavier and more accurate siege mortars. This one, mounted on a reinforced rail flat car, could fire 200-pound shells a distance of 2.5 miles. Although stymied, the Union troops at least knew time was on their side. Amid the fiendish bric-a-brac of trench warfare around Petersburg that spring of 1865, time, alas, had run out for many a young Southerner. Time, too, was running out for Lee and the Confederacy, as, once the weather improved, Grant mustered his men for an all-out assault on Richmond's supply lines, which the outnumbered defenders could not possibly withstand. Before quitting their capital, the Confederates had blown up the ammunition dumps, but the fires had got out of hand. By the time the first Federal troops entered Richmond, a large part of the city was destroyed, virtually the whole of its business district. For decades afterwards, this area was known simply as the Burnt District. Embers from some of the fires would still be smoldering 2 months later. For a long time, photographs like these would be shown as examples of total war, of what can happen when civilized behavior between peoples breaks down, until, of course, war became even more horrifying in our own century. Jefferson Davis and many of his cabinet had fled southwestwards, hoping to reach Texas, while Lee had aimed to link up with the rest of the Confederate Army in North Carolina. But the Federals had been hounding him ever since his withdrawal from Petersburg.
On the second day, he stopped to try to get some supplies, which he understood had been left at a depot for him. They weren't there. So he wasted 24 hours scrounging the countryside for food, and in that 24 hours, the Federal Army gained on him. So they were on his flanks for the next few days. They cut off one wing of the army at the little Battle of Sailor's Creek, just a few miles before he reached Appomattox. And he rose on the 9th of April to start to fight, to break his way out. He suspected that he was ringed, but he didn't know. So the battle opened early in the morning. And when the people who were going forward in his front ran into overwhelming, impossible opposition, he called it off. He realized he was surrounded, and he didn't want to sacrifice his entire force.
Lee fought the war with dignity and with honor and with as much courage as he could muster. And when the end came, he did something that most people in the world like. They like a good loser. Lee, for example, could have continued fighting, and several of his men begged him to take the war away from its formal aspect and turn it into guerrilla war. Let the Southern soldiers take to the hills and the back alleys and the byways and fight guerrilla war. And this was something natural to do because most civil wars are fought that way. And today in the world, as you doubtless know, there are civil wars raging out of control, and they will continue for generations to come. But Lee said no. He felt that to do that would not achieve the one thing the South wanted, its independence. And so at Appomattox on Palm Sunday, 1865, he and Grant sat down. And as two gentlemen, they said, in essence, in the name of God, this is enough.
Lee said he would rather die 1,000 deaths than submit to Grant. But despite talk of unconditional surrender, the Northerner was anxious to offer terms that would end the 4-year-old war. They met at the home of Wilmer McLean, who, trying to get away from the war, had moved from Manassas following the battle there 4 years before, when his house had been taken over by the Confederate Army. The troops here at Appomattox Courthouse were surprised how easily the war ended. Provided they left their weapons, the rebels were free to go home. A careworn Lincoln, this is his last photograph, decided to celebrate the war's end by taking his wife to the Ford Theater. The play, an English comedy, Our American Cousin, had no particular claim to distinction. But the real drama was not acted out on the stage. During the performance on April 14th, while the Lincolns were sitting in the presidential box, a failed actor, John Wilkes Booth, claiming strong Confederate sympathies, entered and sought, in his own way, to reverse the result of the Civil War by shooting the president in the back of the head. In the ensuing pandemonium, Booth escaped, though he broke his leg while jumping to the stage. Lincoln was carried to a house across the street where he died early the next morning. The long journey of the martyred president back to his final resting place at Springfield, Illinois, drew the country together and began the process of transforming the flesh and blood political leader into the legendary national hero. The manhunt for Booth and his accomplices went on, for most were convinced he could not have plotted the murder alone. Some were speedily caught. It turned out that the original intention had been merely to kidnap Lincoln and hold him hostage to win concessions for the South. Nearly 2 weeks after the event, Booth was cornered in Virginia and shot when refusing to surrender. The executions of some of the conspirators on July 7th attracted world attention, in particular because they included a woman, Mary Surratt, who ran the boarding house where Booth had hatched the original kidnapping plot. Some of the witnesses turned their eyes, unable to watch the hangings. Soldiers were posted by the authorities, fearful that the whole business was part of a wider plot to usurp the Union. By the time justice had run its terrible course, the North had had its victory parades and the troops had gone home. Southerners were picking up life again, but were pondering on what might have been.
Their shivered swords are red with dust, their plumed heads are bowed. Their haughty banner, trailed in dust, is now their martial shroud. And plenteous funeral tears have washed the red stains from each brow, and the proud forms, by battle gashed, are free from anguish now. The muffled drum's sad roll has beat the soldier's last tattoo. No more on life's parade shall meet that brave and fallen few. On fame's eternal camping ground their silent tents are spread, and glory guards with solemn round the bivouac of the dead.
When I was a boy, back in the 1930s, there were old maids who had never married because the men they would have married had been killed in that war. There were still signs of what that war had done.
It created a different physiology, human physiology of the whole South. Most of the survivors of the war were physically maimed. There were a few who came back whole, but I was looking recently at some muster rolls of regiments that had returned from the war. You'll go down a long list of a name and they'll say over to the side, lost an arm, lost an eye, lost a leg. So it changed the whole way manhood looked, and it led to a comment by Mary Chestnut, who wrote this great diary from Dixie, in which she said, women of the South are going to have a new definition of male beauty because the whole man just doesn't exist anymore. Take a small town like Calvert, Texas, near where I live. They sent 71 men to the war out of a male military population of 115, and 20 returned.
In all, 620,000 died. The war was costly in other ways, too.
The number of able Southerners who were killed, maimed, permanently wounded in that war meant that the next generation was a generation of defeat, of people who had experienced defeat, who knew defeat. It meant, for example, that there were not enough men for young women to marry. It meant there were not enough able-bodied people to go out and follow the plows in the field. It was a time of deprivation because of the human losses. But equally important was the sense that we were once masters, not merely of our fate, but masters of civilization. This, again, was one of the flowers of civilization as they thought of it. And now suddenly they'd been told everything they believed in was wrong. Their sectionalism was wrong, their slavery was wrong, their whole social system was wrong. It took Southerners many, many years to overcome this kind of barrier, and I'm not sure they have done so completely today. There's a defensiveness in the Southern mentality, which of course I share, that means we tend to take up insults, we tend to feel slurs and slights, we tend to wonder if we really are equal to other sections of the country, and then we boast and brag about relatively modest achievements as a result. The consequences of the war were grave to the South and long-lasting.
Today, many Southerners bemoan their loss of identity. Atlanta, Georgia, a city now like any other. Scant trace remains of the fratricidal struggle a century ago. Here, it's not easy to appreciate what some argue is the burden of Southern history.
Defeat affected the Southern soul massively. There are a number of ways one could try to address this question. I simply like to look at it from this point of view. From the end of the Civil War, for another 75, 85 years, down at least to World War II, the Confederacy was the touchstone of the Southern experience for white Southerners. For white Southerners, the Confederate experience became one filled with nobility and courage when Southerners, their ancestors, fought for principle as the white South saw it, fought for principle with determination and with bravery against a powerful foe. For many white Southerners, it was as William Faulkner had one of his characters say, it was always the morning of July the 3rd at Gettysburg, and you were always with George Pickett with a chance to break through the Union lines on the top of Cemetery Hill.
I think that the Southerner, by and large, is proud of the stalwart and valiant fight he waged. It's the Reconstruction period when the South was placed under martial law, when Southern Americans became the only Americans ever placed under military occupation. And for 9 years, the South had to endure that the hard heel of a military occupying force. I think that's what created the Age of Hate.
Edmund Ruffin of Virginia, a fervent secessionist who had fired one of the first shots at Fort Sumter. On June 17, 1865, after everyone had surrendered, he wrote in his diary, "And now, with what will be near to my last breath, I hereby repeat my unmitigated hatred to Yankee rule, to all political, social, and business connection with Yankees, and to the perfidious, malignant, and vile Yankee race." Then he put a rifle muzzle in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Plantation houses became deserted or were bought up by Northerners, derided as carpetbaggers. What little industry there had been, such as the great Tredegar Iron Works at Richmond, that had supplied half the weapons of the Confederacy, fell into disuse. It would be many decades before the South tried in earnest to become industrialized. For a while, the major activity was simply counting the human cost of it all, though talk of a lost cause rallied the former rebellious ranks. Jefferson Davis, unlike Robert E. Lee, never made it into the pantheon of all American heroes. Arguments raged over what the war had settled.
It was one of the very few wars that really achieved something. One, it kept the Union together, and I think on the whole, who knows what history will say in the long run, on the whole that was a good idea, rather than breaking up into smaller compartments. Two, it freed the slaves. That had to come. It doubtless would have come sooner or later, but I think it would have been later. Those who think that slavery was on the way out misread the history of that day. The price of slaves in the New Orleans market was higher in 1860 than it had ever been before. The South was certain that life would go on in the same old way and that the institution of slavery could be maintained.
The Civil War may not have met the aspirations of black Americans, but it was the making of the United States, and it is for that that those who fought and died will be remembered.
If I were trying to summarize what the Civil War has become, when I was growing up, there were Civil War veterans in every parade. They're all gone. That's the past. But if I were looking back at growing up in America in the 30s, the Civil War is like that most extraordinary sound that used to vibrate through the American night back in the 30s, the train whistle. That's the con. The sound doesn't quite vibrate with the same intensity as it once did. And I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the century, the Civil War will be a historical event that we discuss without perhaps the kind of passion that we once had to deal with. It's something which in a way is part of the American experience, and yet a part of the experience that we finally have perhaps learned how to deal with.